In the rest of our time today, I'm going to talk about some points of background that are important for you to understand. Some of this is going to be general background, which will allow me to go over some of the specific points that Professor Kuntz made that it might be helpful to do a little bit more with. And the other important piece of background that I want to go over in the rest of the time today is I'd like to talk about the Iberian background to what happens as cultures come together and give rise to what will become known as Latin America. So today's class will have dealt with pre-Hispanic cultures as well as the Iberian cultures of Portugal and Spain. And some of the points that I already went over have to do with looking at Latin America from multiple perspectives and the idea of using history as a thread to weave together the many different aspects of Latin American cultures and societies that we will be talking about this semester. In order to do that, there is some general background that we do need to go over, and that's what I want to concentrate on first now. What's the location of Latin America? What kind of environments do we find in Latin America? What are the time periods? What time periods do we need to know about in order to make more sense of all the different aspects of history and culture that we'll talk about? But before I get to the general background, it seems like there's a very basic question that I can ask. And the first time I heard this question asked, I thought, wow, I never really thought about that. And it seemed both so basic but so important. And that is, where does the term Latin America come from? What is Latin and America? What do those two things have to do with each other, for one thing? And how did this term come about? Because when we think of the United States, we do think of North America, and North at least has something to do with geography. Latin, what are we talking about here? Native Americans, or the indigenous peoples of the region that we have come to call Latin America, they had no general terms. They had names for themselves, but they had no general terms for the regions that we think of today. They didn't have a general term for Canada, for the US, for North America, for Meso or Middle America, as Professor Kuntz talked about, Caribbean, South America. No terms like those existed, and certainly nothing like the term Latin America. When Spaniards came to the Americas and began to talk about the regions that they were discovering, exploring, and conquering, they referred to this, what was for them a growing region, generally as the Indies, Las Indias, or they began to, as the political system developed more, they began to refer to different regions within Latin America, the viceroyalties that were referred to earlier, or some of the more specific regions within the viceroyalties. But they didn't have a term, they didn't really have a single term for the whole region itself. When Latin Americans, or we might better refer to them in the early 19th century as Proto-Latin Americans, when Proto-Latin Americans began to write about their own identities or their sense of identity, they would refer to their own regions, the areas that would become the separate independent nations, or when they were trying to refer to the whole region, they would talk about American Spaniards or Southern Americans. But the term South America, of course, refers to a specific continent, but it doesn't encompass all of Latin America. Well, the term Latin America was apparently first used in the early 19th century by a Chilean writer and sociologist named Francisco Bilbao. And he used the term as a way to try to draw a contrast between the parts of the Americas that had been colonized by the Spanish or Portuguese and the parts of the Americas that had been colonized by the British. And he made a contrast between what he called Latin America and what he called Saxon America. But the term Latin America actually then became popular, not in Latin America itself. Surprisingly, it became popular in Europe, especially in France. The term Latin America was first popularized in France, and you would probably ask why that is. And the reason was that in the 1860s, when the term became popular, it became so because the French were interested in that period under Napoleon III in creating a French New World Empire. And they wanted to find a way to express a commonness of descent and purpose with the Spanish heritage of the Americas. France and Spain, however, had a long history of conflict and enmity. And so what France was forced to do, and plus France and Spain were separate countries, so what France was forced to do was to hearken back to the common Latin heritage in terms of language and culture of France and Spain as a way to express their idea, their construct, or what we might consider their fantasy of creating a French empire that drew upon a common European but non-British heritage in the Americas. What's also interesting about the term Latin America is that even today, while Latin Americans certainly do use the term, it tends to be a term that is used more by outsiders to talk about the region as a whole than it is by Latin Americans themselves. And while there's a number of reasons why that's the case, one is that, like Americans do, North Americans that is, since we've monopolized the use of the term American, they identify first with their country. So we call ourselves Americans, and we think first about our nation rather than the continent of North America. And Latin Americans, too, think first about the country and next about the larger region. But also, there's so much diversity, as I already talked about, within Latin America that Mexicans and Argentines and Brazilians, they really see themselves as very different. Now, sometimes in some periods, and we may well be in or going into such a period right now, Latin Americans see themselves as in conflict with the United States politically, economically, maybe even culturally in certain ways. And so that larger sense of Latin American identity may come out more, so that it begins to be, the term begins to be used a little more, have a little bit more currency within Latin America. But in general, it tends to be a term that is used more by outsiders than it is by Latin Americans themselves, who tend to identify most closely, most strongly, of course, with their own nations. So what are those nations? I have a list of those on the outline that you can see here, and I'll just quickly go through the list. The list of nations in Latin America includes the following countries: Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Chile, Paraguay, Uruguay, Argentina, Brazil, and the following parts of the Caribbean: Cuba, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, as well as the island of Puerto Rico, which is not independent, but which is part of the United States. I personally think it is also appropriate to consider the southwestern part of the United States as part of Latin America. And that is because I don't think borders are firm. They're porous, we know that. That's why we're having an ongoing debate about immigration. We know that products flow both ways. We know people go both ways. We know ideas go both ways across the border and many ways around all of the Americas. And in fact, in the 1520s through about the 1540s, the Spanish were exploring many parts of North America. They were concentrated in the Southwest, but they got as far east as Florida and Virginia, and they got as far north on the Pacific coast as the states of Oregon and Washington. So the Spanish were actually in many parts of North America pretty early on, but of course they concentrated their settlements in the region that we would consider to be part of Latin America today. So this is a huge region. It is made up of about 8 million square miles. And today it includes a population of almost 600 million people. So the population of Latin America is at least double the population of the United States. Much of Latin America lies within the tropical zones of the globe, but Latin America also is marked by great environmental diversity. This diversity is a product of several important factors. First, and Professor Kuntz alluded to this, is the presence of several great chains of mountains. The presence of mountains means that elevation, and therefore climate, can change rather markedly within relatively small areas. If we just take Mexico, if we just take central Mexico, the Valley of Mexico, for example, there's enormous environmental diversity because of the presence of chains of mountains, the Sierra Madre Mountains, which are split into an eastern and a more central set of mountains. And those mountains and the different altitudes and climates that go along with them create an environmental diversity that is important, not just so that I can sit here and say there's a lot of environmental diversity and you could drive around and find out that that's true. It's important because that environmental diversity was probably part of the foundation of the development of the complexity of cultures during the pre-Hispanic era that Professor Kuntz already talked about. Environmental diversity is critical because there are different resources from different areas. People need those resources, especially as populations grow. Once populations grow beyond a certain point, and what that population size can differ in different areas, but once populations grow beyond a certain point, it becomes hard for them to produce all the food and all the goods that they need for everyday life. And so trade becomes important. And as trade grows and population grows, that leads to other kinds of changes. As society becomes more economically complex, it tends to become more politically complex. As population grows, and people compete for resources, and there's only one word I have to say from the year 2007 that illustrates the point perfectly, and that's the word oil. As people compete for resources, that leads to political conflict, and so more complex forms of government form. So environmental diversity can be very important for understanding the development of complexity of society. This was true in Mesoamerica. It was true in the Andes. And it was true in other parts of the world where early civilizations developed as well in the period prior to 1492. And 1492 is a year that I'll come back and talk about a little bit more later on today. All of you know that year. You know why it's important, but it's actually important for a number of reasons, not just because of Columbus's activities. Another environmental factor that's important has to do with the presence of rivers and river systems. Rivers can provide water, but in the pre-Hispanic era, rivers were also important because they were used for transportation, to move people, to move goods. The most important river in Latin America, of course, is the Amazon. The Amazon runs most of the length of South America. It carries about 10% of all the water that drains from the world's continents into the oceans, and it has the largest volume of water gathered by any river system. Rainfall is also important. Rainfall has to do with elevation. Location, elevation, river systems. All of these help to create and explain the environmental diversity which marks Latin America. This environmental diversity, as I've already mentioned, is critical for the development of complexity of culture, but it's also important because as native or indigenous cultures developed, the regions that they live in help to shape the cultural characteristics that they develop. Environment doesn't determine culture. I don't want to be heard to say that. That's not something that I believe. But environment certainly affects culture. In certain ways, it shapes it. But culture, as something that is human-made, also in turn shapes the environment. We know that's true today. Again, I need to use two words this time to illustrate the point: global warming. But we shouldn't assume that it's only modern or contemporary human beings that shape the environment. People did it in the past as well. Professor Kuntz mentioned the fall of the Maya, classic Maya civilization. And some of the theories, there are some varying theories that try to explain why classic Maya civilization declined. But one of the theories has to do with overpopulation and overexploitation of the environment. So this is an ancient problem and not simply a modern problem. One of the amazing things about Latin America in the pre-Hispanic period is that people and cultures thrived in regions that today sometimes are not very populated. And archaeologists study these areas and try to understand why and how that was. And we don't fully have the answer. But many parts of the Amazon, for example, and the shorelines nearest to the river, many parts of the Amazon river basin were more populated in the prehistoric past than they are now. And it's an interesting question of why that is. Another aspect of the development of culture within the environments of Latin America is that complex cultures developed in areas, sometimes in tropical rainforest areas, for example, that today it's very hard for us to understand how it was that so many people lived in these regions, supported themselves in these very hot and humid environments, some of which make Houston summers look like a picnic. And they developed cultural complexity in areas that it's difficult to understand how it is that human beings did this and why they did it in these areas that before the invention of modern air conditioning would not be places that you or I would necessarily really want to live. So, environmental diversity has for thousands of years been a key characteristic of Latin America and the regions within it. It's in part because of all this diversity that it is difficult to discuss Latin America as a whole. I'm sure that I and other faculty members who speak this semester will make generalizations about Latin America. Most of them will be true, some of them will be gross oversimplifications. But in general, we tend to look at Latin America in terms of regions and in terms of the countries that make it up, as I already talked about. I mentioned the countries. What about the regions? Latin America is usually divided into 4 distinct geocultural regions, and these regions include the following. First, of course, because it's the northernmost region and Professor Kuhn's concentrated on it, is Mesoamerica or Middle America. And it's referred to as Middle America or Mesoamerica to distinguish it from North America culturally, although it is part of North America geographically. Mesoamerica is made up primarily of what is today Mexico, Guatemala, and Belize. Then we have Central America, which runs from El Salvador and Honduras in the north to Panama in the south. Then, of course, we have South America, which is a continent, and which includes Colombia and Venezuela from the north to Chile in the south. And then there are the Spanish-speaking and or Spanish heritage islands of the Caribbean: Cuba, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Haiti and the Dominican Republic share an island, the island of Hispaniola or Española, as it was known in the colonial period, and Puerto Rico, as I already mentioned. It is very common to talk about these 4 areas, and the reason is that obviously they're smaller, they have more in common with each other, but also the cultures of the pre-Hispanic period, with the exception of South America, where there is a cultural complexity that I'll mention in a minute. The cultures within each of these areas were more similar to each other than they were to the cultures of other regions. So that's why it's helpful to differentiate among the regions. In South America, you have 2 different regions with different kinds of cultures and languages developing. On the one hand, you have the Andes, where by the late pre-Hispanic period, the Inca civilization had developed. And then you have the Amazon River cultures in the eastern sector of South America, which were culturally and in terms of the languages spoken very different from the Andean region. Another very important set of concepts for students and scholars of Latin America alike to have some understanding of has to do with time. And as you can see on the outline, there are a lot of terms for the different time periods. I'll talk first but briefly about the time periods and the terminology that archaeologists and art historians use when they talk about the pre-Hispanic, pre-Columbian, or prehistoric past. We know that human beings did not evolve in the Americas. Human evolution took place someplace else, in Africa to be exact, and a whole lot earlier than there's any evidence of population in the Americas. There is a lot of debate among archaeologists and others about when human beings first came into the Americas and from where they came. I tend to take the position that the evidence suggests that there was human settlement in the Americas as far back as about 25,000, maybe even 30,000 years ago. But the evidence for that has to be understood in part as a process of inference, by understanding both where there were different populations at different points in time in the earliest period of settlement that we know about, and Professor Kuntz talked a little bit about that. And there is also the evidence of the tremendous diversity of cultures and languages that developed, and that suggests that in order for that diversity to develop, it took a pretty long time for that to happen. Diversity and complexity developed over thousands of years. And when archaeologists talk about this past before the arrival of Europeans, they talk first about either the Lithic or Paleo-Indian period, which may range from roughly 25,000 years ago to 7,000 BCE. And one small point that I wanted to mention in relation to Professor Kuntz's comments was his use of the letters BCE and CE, because you may be more familiar with the terms BC and AD. BCE and CE are the terms that archaeologists tend to use now to denote the major time periods. BCE means before Common Era, and CE means the same thing as AD, but it means Common Era, and it's a more general and neutral way of talking about time periods in history, so that we don't get into cultural and religious issues by using the Christian calendar as the calendar, the only calendar, or at least the terms through which we define important periods of human history. So the Lithic period, the period when human beings settled the Americas, moved throughout it, and began to develop and differentiate themselves from the old world cultural traditions from which they came, and began to develop the first sets of differences that would mark those four regions of Latin America and the Americas as a whole that I already talked about. Following the Lithic period was the Archaic period, and the Archaic period spans from 7,000 to 1500 BCE. The Archaic is a very important period because human beings did two important things. They began to grow maize or corn, as well as other crops. These were crops that were domesticated, that is, they depend on human beings for their propagation. They can't reproduce themselves without human intervention. So human beings went from gathering plants to sowing and depending on them in new ways. So people of the Americas developed agriculture, and connected to that is that they began to live in more permanent and settled villages. Not necessarily in all of the Americas, not necessarily in every part of what will become Latin America, But in many regions, especially the core areas of settlement, they begin to live in permanent and settled villages. And this is a very important change, because without that, you're not going to get the rise of civilization. In the formative or pre-classic period from 1500 BCE to 150 CE, the first evidence of cultural elaboration comes from this period. We get larger and architecturally more complex sites. We get monumental architecture. And monumental architecture implies very strongly the ability to use labor. It implies very strongly the ability not just to use labor, but to compel or coerce it. Because if it were me, I'm not really that anxious to go out and carry a whole lot of stones and start to make a whole lot of stones or a whole lot of dirt, because actually the first monumental architecture were dirt mounds. I'm not that anxious to do that. So probably somebody's going to have to make me, and somebody's going to have to make lots of us do that. The Olmec culture that Professor Kuntz talks about dates from the formative period. Following that is the classic period from 150 to 650 in the central region and about 900 in the southern region of Mesoamerica. And this is the period where there's a marked growth in population. There's a big demographic change. Really, there's an explosion of population. The site of Teotihuacan develops during this period, and Maya civilization develops and grows during this period, and the end date of the period depends on the region that we're talking about. And then we get to the post-classic period. The starting date for the post-classic obviously varies. And I'm going to give you 1519 as the end date for the post-classic period. 1519 is another very significant year, almost as significant as 1492. 1519 is the year that the first Spaniards begin to explore the mainland, and it's the year, it's really significant because in addition to their explorations, it's the year that Spaniards begin to march into the central region of what will become Mexico, and they start to undertake the conquest of the Aztecs with many, many important consequences. The Spaniards reached South America and began the period of conquest somewhat later. But the dates I've given you are dates that are roughly good for much of Latin America in understanding the prehistory. Archaeologists who work in specific regions may use a slightly different terminology, but the idea that I want to emphasize is that in every region there were stages of development, and the civilizations and societies that the Spaniards encountered were the products of thousands of years of cultural development. There are also some terms from European history that are going to be very useful for us to know something about. And then, of course, there are also terms that are used to describe the periods of time that Latin American historians refer to in breaking up the long span of Latin American history. First, terms from European history that are useful for understanding something about Latin America. First, of course, is the medieval period, which might be considered to run, and the dates I give are approximate with some variation among scholars, but we're talking about roughly the period from 500 to 1350 CE. It can be divided into an earlier and late period, the dividing line at around the year 1000. The medieval period is the period that witnessed the decline of the great civilizations of the Greco-Roman world, and European society becomes organized into smaller ethnic political systems, These were often feudal in nature. Peasant labor was the fuel for the agriculture and economy of the times, and powerful lords ruled. This period, the medieval period, was particularly important in the history of Spain and Portugal. Many of the institutions that the Spanish and the Portuguese brought to the New World were actually medieval in origin. They had become modernized in certain ways due to some of the political realities of life in Iberia in the centuries prior to 1492 and 1519, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit today. But the medieval period and its institution and ways of thinking is very important for understanding the economy, the culture, and the politics of Spain and Portugal in the relevant periods. The Renaissance from 1350 to 1550 was a period of rapid change in European societies. Commerce, trade, political entities, learning, book publishing, all expanded during this period. And what's interesting about the Renaissance is that in some ways the Renaissance is both a consequence of, yet an inspiration for, the colonizing of the Americas. And the reason why that's an important idea is that it helps us understand that the Americas played a role in the construction of Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries, and Europe obviously played a very important role in the construction of the Americas. But when we think about the Americas, and we think about Latin America in particular, we also have to think about the idea of the presence of native people, whose presence and whose civilizations will help to shape the way that Europeans influence what becomes Latin America. One more point about the chronology of European history is that the early modern period from 1550 to 1800 is the period which is marked by the definitive expansion of European powers into overseas colonies. The European powers compete with each other to have domains or realms of influence that are recognized by all other European powers. Latin America is, of course, central. North America is central as well to that process, but similar expansionism was taking place. A similar expansionism was taking place in other parts of the world. And by the 19th century, Africa, India, the Middle East will become the parts of the world that are the major region in terms of the impact of colonialism and colonization. But one of the things that's important about Latin America, one of the reasons that it is useful to know and understand something about Latin American history, is that it's in Latin America that the shape of colonial rule really was first formed. And that's not to say that other colonial powers followed exactly what the Spanish and the Portuguese did, but they were certainly influenced by it. And they were influenced by it in very basic and important ways. But the early modern period's important for Latin America for some other reasons as well, in terms of some of the changes that are taking place in Europe that will be so profound in terms of influence on Latin America. And that, of course, has to do with the rise, for example, of capitalism, the rise and development of capitalism, because capitalism will reshape Latin America and it will reshape the entire world in important ways. And we also see in Europe during the early modern period the rise of what will become the modern nation state. And nationalism, it's a major force in the world today, and it was a major force in the world, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, in Latin America, and then in other parts of the non-Anglo-Saxon, non-European parts of the world. Latin American history. What are the common chronological terms used to describe its periods? That is, how do we periodize? What is the periodization? We can talk first about the colonial period. The colonial period is usually divided into two shorter periods, the early colonial period from 1492 to 1700. What happens during this period is pretty evident from what has already been discussed. Europeans come, Europeans encounter, they explore, they conquer. But after they conquer, they have to rule. And so the early colonial period is really about, I would say it's most centrally about conquest and developing the forms of rule that will characterize the colonial period in and across Latin America. The late colonial period from 1700 to 1825 is a period that sees first the revitalization of Spanish rule. And the interesting thing about the revitalization of Spanish rule is that it will ultimately lead to the independence, that is, the breaking away of most of Latin America from Spain, eventually Portugal, and the formation of independent nation states. The national period from 1825 to about 1900 is the period that sees the formation of what will become the modern nation states of Latin America. This period, the 19th century, is characterized by an seemingly almost endless set of struggles over power within Latin America, but that struggle for power was accompanied by the increasing dominance over Latin American economies by Britain and by the US. So what happens is that Spain and Portugal are, in a sense, especially economically, in an economic sense, replaced by Britain and the emerging juggernaut of the world economy, the US. Britain and the US replace Spain and Portugal as the important economic centers of power which shape the development of Latin America in many important ways. But when I say that Britain and the US shape the development of Latin America, I do need to qualify that statement, because Latin Americans really play the central role in shaping the histories of their own nations. But they do it in dialogue with, but sometimes under pressure from, these global economic powers, who are they're not colonizers. Latin American nations are independent. They are no longer colonized formally. They're not politically connected in the same sense as the regions of Latin America were to Spain and Portugal during the colonial period. But Britain and the US do come to play very important roles in the economies and politics of Latin America during the national period. Then we get to the modern period. What's the modern period? Well, let's say the modern period is the 20th and also now the 21st century, and it's a continuing story of power and political struggle. The modern period is the story of modernization and development. It's the story of the development of the economy in many parts of Latin America, but it's also the story of inequity, inequities within Latin America. If Venezuela was a middle-class society in the same way that the United States has considered itself to be, we probably would not see Hugo Chavez. So there's a lot of development of politics, economics, and culture, but there's inequity within Latin America, and there's inequity between Latin America and other parts of the world, especially North America and Europe. But there's also been incredible cultural, artistic, and literary development during the 19th and 20th centuries that accompanied the nationalism and the political and economic changes that I'm alluding to here and that we'll talk about in more detail at other points in the semester. So in terms of general background, we've talked about the term Latin America, where it comes from and what some of its significance is. We've talked about the countries that are part of Latin America. I've told you a little bit about the major geographic regions that make up Latin America, and we've talked about the terms for time periods. I'd like to go on and talk about Iberia in the time that I have remaining for today, but before I do that, does anybody have any questions? Anything you'd like to go over in more detail, or anything you need me to repeat or explain more about? And if you have questions, remember you can use those mics. Just press down the button that's in the center. No questions? Okay. We're going to talk about Iberia, about Spain and Portugal, because it's critical to understand Spain and Portugal in the especially in the 14th and 15th centuries, because this was a region of the world that was crucial in terms of the history of exploration and expansion. Exploration and expansion to the Americas. It is important to remember that exploration and expansion were not activities unique to Europeans. The Mongols, the Chinese, both were interested in exploration. Muslim peoples expanded their territories, and I'll talk about how they expanded their territory from North Africa into the peninsula of Iberia, into the Kingdom of Portugal, into the emerging nation of Spain. But the impulse for exploration and expansion in Portugal and in Spain are crucial for our purposes, because these activities ultimately led to the founding of what becomes Latin America and to the development of the transatlantic slave trade. And I mention the transatlantic slave trade here because the slave trade is one of the motors for economic development. The development of the slave trade has many consequences, however, human, economic, and political. And what's also important about mentioning the slave trade now is that Latin American history and culture is actually the product of the meeting and intermingling of three streams of people and cultures, two of which I've already mentioned. The cultures native or indigenous to Latin America, European culture, especially as it was embodied by the Spanish and the Portuguese, but there's a third stream of people and culture that's also critical to understanding the birth of culture and civilization in Latin America in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, and that is the coming of Africans who came as enslaved laborers, worked throughout the Americas, in Brazil, in the Caribbean, and in some parts of Spanish America, of mainland Spanish America as well. But before we get to that topic, and before we get also to the issues of encounter and conquest, it is important to know something about Iberia, about Portugal, and about Spain. What is Iberia? Iberia is the southernmost peninsula of Europe. It lies between Europe, southern Europe, and northern Africa. And next week we'll take a look at some maps to make sure it's clear, both in terms of the regions and the countries that I've been talking about. Iberia, like most parts of the world, has a long history. It was first settled by small groups of people who came from Northern Europe, other parts of Southern Europe, perhaps Northern Africa. But for our purposes, what's important is that Iberia became part of the Roman world, that is, it was part of the Roman Empire. But beginning late in the 5th century, Germanic invasions from Northern Europe led to the establishment of the Visigothic kingdom. And the Visigothic kingdom controlled Iberia from about CE 500 to 700. In Iberia, there's, even today, evidence of Roman influence, evidence of Visigothic influence, but there's also evidence of Muslim influence, because Muslims coming out of northern Africa in the early 8th century, that is in the early 700s, Muslims began in that period to move from North Africa into Iberia, into southern Europe, conquer parts of Iberia, and that conquest and subsequent rule in certain regions of Iberia set off one of the most critical events in the history of Portugal and Spain. That is, Muslim movement and conquest set off a prolonged struggle of approximately 8 centuries, pretty long time, a prolonged struggle in which Iberian Christians fought against Muslims who had settled in Iberia as well. That 8 centuries of conflict, which is known as the Reconquest or Reconquista, is really important to us because many of the characteristics that the Spanish and the Portuguese, culturally, politically, and economically, many of the characteristics of settlement and characteristics of colonial rule, the style of colonial rule, the institutions of colonial rule, come out of the Reconquest. These are institutions that were often medieval in origin and nature, but were shaped in special ways by the Reconquest. In looking at Iberia and the history of European exploration, one of the interesting questions or issues that's important to consider is, why are we even talking about Portugal at all? And the issues that I'd like to talk about in the rest of the time that I have today have to do with Portugal, the Reconquest, and the Spain of the important and very famous rulers Isabella and Ferdinand, because that's the Spain that comes into the Americas. First, Portugal. Why, when we talk about the early history of European exploration in the New World, are we talking about Portugal at all? Because while certainly you're all familiar with the nation of Portugal, in terms of nations, the nations of Europe that have a really major place, are really major players on the world stage today, probably we wouldn't think of Portugal as one of those nations. Yet it's crucial for the early history of European exploration in the Americas. The historian C.R. Boxer wrote a book, a famous book, a good book, in the 1960s called The Portuguese Seaborne Empire. And in that book, Boxer asks that question: why Portugal? And he says, and here I'm going to quote from Boxer, "Why was this small, rather poor, culturally backward nation perched on the southwest coast of Europe so dramatically successful in that great century of enterprise that began about 1440? Again, why did this achievement fade to a shadow of itself within a span of about 50 years? In other words, why did Spain replace Portugal as the important colonizing power, especially in the Americas? And even more enigmatic, why did possession of empire fail to act as a catalyst in Portugal? In the Netherlands, in Britain, in Spain, and in France, the possession of empire worked like yeast, not only on the economic and political life of the nation, but also on its cultural life. The region of Iberia today that's known as Portugal was in Roman times known as Lusitania. This name came from a people who inhabited the region known as the Lusitani. They were a mixture of Iberians as well as Celts who had migrated into Iberia from northern Europe. Roman Lusitania was much like the rest of Iberia in that Roman influence was very strong in terms of language, culture, and daily and economic life. The Visigoths conquered Lusitania, as they did other kingdoms on the peninsula of Iberia, and the Muslim forces moved in and proceeded to try to do the same thing. Northern Lusitania, or what is today northern Portugal, as well as the northern parts of what will eventually become the Kingdom of Spain, but at this time it's the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, which are most important. These regions became the center of resistance to the Muslims. These regions became the center of the efforts of the Reconquest. Portugal emerged in the 12th century as an independent kingdom, and soon thereafter its limits expanded to about the approximate present-day limits of the modern nation of Portugal. There are a lot of aspects of early Portuguese history that I could talk about in relation to the history of exploration. But I think the point about Portuguese in this period that I most want to mention and most want to emphasize has to do with the idea that Portuguese society was oriented towards its coastline, most especially its Atlantic coastline. Fishing villages were very important as the Kingdom of Portugal developed. Of course, agriculture was important as well, but fishing villages, sailing, and trade were crucial. These were crucial developments that proved decisive for the later history of Portugal. During the 1400s, that is in the 15th century, this culture, this maritime culture of fishing, sailing, and trade would have a momentous impact on the Portuguese and ultimately on world history. Portuguese sailors came in contact with crude compasses that were used by Arab traders. And the Arab traders had gotten the idea of the compass from the Chinese. The Portuguese began to use them and develop them. And this made for, the use of compasses made for an important improvement in the efficiency of sailing. At the same time, in the early 15th century, Portuguese shipbuilders began to innovate. And they began to emphasize the building of lighter, smaller ships called caravels, which were easy to navigate. And they began to sail longer distances. A member of the Portuguese ruling family, the famous prince, Prince Henry, who is also sometimes known as Prince Henry the Navigator, was an important patron of sailing. Prince Henry lived from 1394 to 1460. And he himself never sailed very far. He was a patron of navigation and sailing, but he wasn't much of a navigator or sailor himself. But he was important both because he gave support economically to specific expeditions, and he was a patron of sailors and a patron of sailing and exploration more generally. He used his palace as a kind of information center for charts, for maps, and for compiling data about winds and currents. His own study of sailing contributed much to Portuguese maritime skills, and he encouraged and sponsored many explorations. So several factors come together to give Portugal an important role in overseas exploration. Portugal's geographic position, the adoption of compasses, the existence of a royal patron who supports sailing and who supports the creation of new maps and sailing charts, which make for more accurate sailing plans and make for more accurate and expanding knowledge about the globe. And by the way, Europeans of this time knew that the world was round. Columbus was not the person who, Columbus did not operate under the idea that the world was round and everybody else thought it was flat. It was pretty well known that the world was round. What wasn't known, and what will become important knowledge for both the Portuguese and then Columbus and the Spanish, was the size of the globe, the location of the continents, and the relation of land masses and water. Because Europeans of this time tended to think, well, first of all, they didn't know about all the land masses that existed. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about the discovery of the New World. But also, they tended to believe, Europeans tended to believe during this time that there was a lot more water and a lot less land than actually existed. And that's why what will become Columbus's plan of sailing west to reach the east seemed like a sensible idea because it is based on some misconceptions about global geography. Be that as it may, back to the Portuguese. It's the Portuguese that first began to explore important areas of the world that play a role ultimately in the discovery by Europeans of the Americas. Northern Africa was the first area that the Portuguese began to explore. At first, they were interested in it for geopolitical reasons. They were interested in this region for geopolitical reasons. And that's because of the presence of the Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula. They have come out of, Islamic forces have come out of northern Africa, and the Portuguese are very anxious to establish a foothold in northern Africa. They don't really want to conquer northern Africa so much as they want to capture some territory to establish themselves as a power that Islamic rulers need to respect. They also want to establish a foothold because they want to begin to establish relations of trade. In 1415, the Portuguese capture the port city of Ceuta in northern Africa. And this is important. It gives them a place from which they will have a permanent presence. And it's a base through which merchants with capital can operate to expand trade with northern and other parts of Africa. So the link between Portugal and Africa, which is really created out of the Islamic movements and then the Reconquest War, which is a response to these movements, the link between Portugal and Africa is solidified beginning in 1415, so pretty early in the 15th century. What then begins to happen is that the Portuguese, first patronized and with the oversight of Prince Henry, begin to send a number of expeditions along the West African coast. Some were exploratory, some of these expeditions were more commercial. But the Portuguese soon discover that Africa can be an important source of wealth. Africa itself can be an important source of wealth in gold, in ivory, and in slaves. Between 1450 and 1500, the Portuguese had already played a key role in the early development of what will become the transatlantic slave trade. In those 50 years, in that 50-year period, about 150,000 slaves were already taken from Africa by the Portuguese, and those slaves never went to the New World. Those slaves went to Portugal and to some islands colonized by the Portuguese in the southern Atlantic. And those islands were very important, especially the Azores and Madeira Islands. Those islands were very important because the slaves were used to do something that will become critical in the history of Latin America. They were used to help produce a particular crop, something that you like a lot because you either eat the caloric version of it or the fake non-caloric version of it. You eat it a lot, probably every day, as do I, and that's sugar. And I won't go into this in detail now, but the growing of sugar is pretty complex. It needs a lot of labor. and African slaves were the primary form of labor used to grow and harvest sugar, first on these islands and then in the Americas. The plantation isn't a New World invention. The first plantations were really developed on these islands in the southern Atlantic. So Portuguese activity exploring the west coast of Africa, first the north and then the west coast of Africa, and then they began to sail slowly down the entire coastline of Africa. The Portuguese activities of exploration were crucial. Eventually the Portuguese will sail around the southern tip of Africa and they will reach India. Textiles, spices from India become important in the emerging trade routes of the late 15th century. But there also begins to be this idea on the part of Europeans who have also developed a taste for spices, not only from South Asia, that is from India, but also from the Middle East. There begin to be ideas about quicker ways to get spices and other resources. And lots of thought goes into developing routes around Africa and India, over land, or over water. Portugal and Spain then begin a competition of exploration and discovery. And that competition is also crucial for understanding how Christopher Columbus ever got any backing, for understanding how and why what Columbus did, and why it had so much significance. Without getting into Columbus here, what I do want to say about Portugal and Spain is that Portugal was really prepared, the Kingdom of Portugal was really prepared to explore and trade. They were not particularly interested in setting up a permanent empire, especially not in this early period that I'm talking about here. They really weren't equipped to do so. They have a king, they have an army, but Portugal doesn't have the same kind of population as the larger kingdoms of Spain did. And it really wants to go in a more economic direction. Spain, on the other hand, Spain is somewhat less prepared or less pre-adapted for exploration, though it does eventually become an important power in terms of exploration. Spain is more prepared to govern and to conquer. And in order to understand Spain's expertise in terms of governance and conquest, it is important to come back to this issue of the reconquest. Like many other topics that I'm racing over, there's a lot I could say about the reconquest. But I'm going to summarize the impact of the reconquest in the way that I do on the outline here. The reconquest isn't 8 straight centuries of full-out war. It's 8 centuries of war that ebb and flow, but that don't end until 1492. 1492 is important because of Columbus, but it's also important because it is the year when Spain conquered the last remaining Muslim kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula, the Kingdom of Granada. So you've got centuries of war And centuries of war combine with the medieval culture and institutions of what will become the nation of Spain, but which in this period is made up of a number of independent kingdoms. But the two largest kingdoms, Castile and Aragon, will come together in an important alliance relating to the marriage of their monarchs. But before I get to that marriage and those monarchs, I want to talk briefly about the significance of the Reconquest. War, especially being in a constant state of war, tends to lead to strong leaders. We're having a debate in our country right now about the nature of the presidency. And this debate over a strong presidency is, in fundamental ways, related to the fact that we're at war. In this time, the Reconquest helped to lead to the development of strong monarchs and the development of strong institutions of central governance in the Iberian kingdoms. It also helps to lead to urbanization. Iberia was quite urbanized for this time period in comparison to other parts of Europe. Why urbanism? Why cities? Because cities are easier to defend. You can build walls around them, for one thing. Iberia was also ethnically and religiously diverse. There were Christians, Muslims, and Jews. And Spain develops a culture and legal system in which it has experience ruling over diverse peoples. You can see why that would be useful. This rule, this style of rule, and especially the coexistence that developed, is known by the term convivencia, which could be translated as coexistence, and this is a recognized cultural value of late medieval and Renaissance Spain. And to talk about the rest of the characteristics of Iberia that are a result of the Reconquest, we will do that next week.